If the next war between the United States and China begins, you probably won't see it. You won't hear explosions, you won't watch missiles streak across the sky. Instead, your GPS will glitch, military networks will desynchronize, precision weapons will miss by miles, and commanders will be forced to make life or death decisions with incomplete information. That's not a malfunction, that's a battlefield. Because in modern warfare, satellites are no longer support assets. They are the battlefield itself. Blind them, and everything below collapses. Aircraft lose their edge, navies lose coordination, entire doctrines unravel in real time. Here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to answer. If one side disables the other's satellites without firing a shot, is that already an act of war? And if the war starts without noise, without smoke, without proof, who decides when it has actually begun? For decades, space was treated as a high-tech advantage, important but distant. Satellites provided navigation, communication, early warning. They made modern warfare faster, cleaner, more precise, but they were never supposed to be targets. That assumption is now dead. Today, nearly every critical military function depends on assets in orbit. GPS guides aircraft, ships, missiles, and ground forces. Satellites synchronize command and control networks across continents. Early warning constellations detect missile launches in seconds. Intelligence platforms track movements long before troops ever make contact. Remove space, and modern militaries don't degrade gracefully. They fall apart unevenly and dangerously. This is what makes space uniquely unstable as a battlefield. There are no borders, no airspace violations, no clear red lines. A satellite doesn't need to be destroyed to be neutralized. It can be jammed, spoofed, dazzled, or temporarily blinded. And when that happens, the effects cascade instantly across land, air, and cyber domains. That's why both Washington and Beijing now talk about space in the same breath as deterrence. Not because they want to fight there, but because they fear being caught unprepared if someone else does. The problem is escalation. In traditional domains, attacks are visible. A missile launch is unmistakable. A strike leaves evidence. Space attacks can be ambiguous by design. Was it interference, a test, a coincidence, a technical failure? By the time intent becomes clear, the damage may already be done. This is why space is not just another domain of warfare. It's the only one where confusion itself can be weaponized. And in a crisis between the United States and China, confusion is exactly what turns tension into catastrophe. Neither Washington nor Beijing talks openly about fighting a war in space. They don't have to. Their preparations already say enough. On the American side, the shift is visible in doctrine. Space is no longer treated as a benign utility layer. It's treated as a contested environment. Redundancy, dispersion, rapid reconstitution. The language has changed from dominance to survivability. That alone tells you what planners expect to face. Because if satellites were truly safe, you wouldn't need to plan for losing them. China's approach is different in tone, but not in intent. Instead of focusing on resilience first, Beijing has spent years developing ways to deny space to others. Not necessarily by blowing satellites apart, that creates debris and international backlash, but by finding methods that sit in the gray zone. Temporary blindness, signal disruption, close proximity maneuvers that look like inspection until they don't. The most dangerous part is that both sides are preparing for the same opening move. Not a massive strike, not escalation on day one, but a limited action designed to create confusion while preserving deniability. A short window where one side suddenly loses awareness, coordination, or timing, just long enough for advantage elsewhere. And that's where deterrence starts to crack. Because deterrence depends on clarity, on knowing who did what and why. In space, that clarity disappears. A satellite drifts off orientation, a signal drops. Engineers argue whether it's interference or failure. Commanders argue whether it's coincidence or attack. Meanwhile, the clock keeps ticking. Both militaries are training for that moment, the moment when information is incomplete, attribution is uncertain, and the pressure to act rises anyway. Exercises increasingly assume degraded space support. War games revolve around contested orbits. Decision makers are being conditioned to operate in the dark. That preparation is rational. It's also terrifying. Because when both sides expect space to fail first, the temptation to make it fail first becomes stronger. And once that logic takes hold, the most dangerous battlefield in the world won't be the one with the most firepower. It will be the one where no one can see clearly enough to stop. When most people imagine weapons in space, they picture missiles racing upward and satellites shattering into debris. That's not how this fight is likely to start. The most effective space weapons don't explode at all. They interfere. A satellite doesn't need to be destroyed to be neutralized. It only needs to be made unreliable. Jam its communications and it can't relay data, spoof its navigation signals, and its positioning becomes suspect. Dazzle its sensors with directed energy and its eyes are effectively closed, temporarily, plausibly, and without leaving a smoking crater in orbit. This is the appeal of non-kinetic space warfare. It's quiet, it's reversible, and most importantly, it's deniable. A GPS disruption can be blamed on solar activity. A communications blackout can be labeled technical failure. A satellite tumbling out of alignment might be explained as software error. Each incident on its own is ambiguous. Together, they can cripple an entire military system. Then there are co-orbital threats. Satellites that maneuver close to others under the guise of inspection or servicing. In peacetime, these activities are framed as innovation. In crisis, the same proximity becomes leverage. A satellite doesn't need to collide to threaten. It only needs to be close enough to make operators nervous. This is where escalation becomes dangerous. Because once satellites begin behaving unpredictably, commanders face a dilemma they've never fully solved. Do you treat it as an attack and respond? Or do you wait for confirmation while your situational awareness erodes by the minute? Waiting preserves stability. Waiting also risks losing the initiative. And responding carries its own dangers. A kinetic strike creates debris that endangers everyone's satellites, including your own. A non-kinetic response may be invisible, misunderstood, or misattributed. In space, every option carries strategic risk. That's why both sides are investing heavily in tools that sit just below the threshold of open warfare. Not to win a war in space, but to shape the first hours of a war everywhere else. Because if you control what the enemy can see, hear, and trust, even briefly, you don't need explosions to change the outcome. Space looks vast. In reality, it's fragile. A single modern military satellite can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to design, launch, and operate. It may take years to replace. And once it's in orbit, there's no quick repair crew, no rapid redeployment, no armored backup. That's the math defenders can't escape. An attacker doesn't need to destroy an entire constellation. They only need to disrupt a few critical nodes at the right moment. Jam a relay satellite during a deployment window. Blind an ISR platform during force movement. Spoof timing signals just long enough to break synchronization across a joint operation. The cost to do that can be shockingly low compared to the damage it causes. Electronic interference can be generated from the ground. Co-orbital maneuvering costs fuel, not factories. Temporary dazzling can be achieved with systems far cheaper than the satellite they affect. The exchange ratio heavily favors the side willing to accept ambiguity and short-term disruption over permanent destruction. Defense, meanwhile, is expensive and imperfect. Hardening satellites against every possible interference raises cost and complexity. Redundancy helps, but redundancy means more satellites, more launches, more exposure. Rapid replacement sounds good on paper, but launch capacity is finite and contested in wartime. And even a replacement satellite is vulnerable the moment it becomes operational. This is the asymmetric trap of space warfare. The attacker chooses timing. The defender pays continuously. And unlike air or sea, there is no way to surge defensive coverage in orbit. You can't move a carrier strike group to protect a satellite. You can't reposition an air defense umbrella fast enough to matter. Space assets are predictable by physics. Their paths are known, their windows are fixed, and their vulnerabilities are studied relentlessly. That's why space isn't just another domain. It's the one where initiative compounds faster than resilience. And once the numbers turn against you, no amount of technological superiority can change the fundamental equation. This is how wars that no one plans for actually begin. Not with declarations, not with missiles, but with an incident that can't be ignored. A satellite loses attitude control at the worst possible moment. A navigation signal degrades during a major exercise. A command network suddenly desynchronizes while forces are maneuvering in close proximity. Engineers argue over causes. Intelligence agencies debate attribution. Politicians demand answers that don't exist yet. And the clock keeps moving. In space, ambiguity is not stabilizing, and it's corrosive. The longer uncertainty persists, the more pressure builds on commanders to act before they lose control of the situation. Waiting feels responsible. Waiting also feels dangerous, because if the disruption was intentional, every minute of hesitation compounds the disadvantage. This is where escalation slips its leash. A defensive response is ordered elsewhere. Forces are repositioned just in case. ISR coverage intensifies, electronic measures are expanded. None of this is meant to be provocative, but all of it is visible, and visibility breeds interpretation. The other side responds in kind. What began as a silent disruption in orbit now has consequences on the ground, at sea, and in the air. Aircraft fly closer. Ships maneuver more aggressively. Cyber probes increase. The margin for error shrinks with every move. And here's the most dangerous part. Neither side may be entirely sure who started it. Was the satellite interference deliberate or accidental? Was it a test that went wrong? A signal crossed at the wrong time? In space, intent is often inferred after reactions begin, but not before. By the time clarity arrives, escalation has momentum. This is why space incidents are uniquely destabilizing. They don't create immediate casualties, which makes them easier to initiate. But they undermine the information environment that prevents miscalculation everywhere else. In a US-China crisis, a single ambiguous event in orbit could trigger a chain reaction no one can stop quickly, because the tools designed to restore clarity depend on the very systems that just went dark. And once decision makers are forced to operate blind, the line between caution and catastrophe becomes dangerously thin. The most unsettling thing about a war that starts in space is how quickly it stops feeling abstract. When satellites fail, it isn't just militaries that lose capability. Civilian life absorbs the shock first. GPS outages ripple into commercial aviation, maritime shipping, emergency services, and financial networks that rely on precise timing. Flights reroute or ground, ports slow. Ambulances lose routing accuracy. Markets experience unexplained disruptions measured in milliseconds, enough to trigger chaos. None of this looks like war, but it feels like one. The danger lies in scale. Modern societies are tightly synchronized systems. Navigation, timing, communications, weather forecasting, disaster response, all of it depends on space-based infrastructure that most people never see. Disrupt a few key links, and the effects cascade faster than governments can explain them. This creates a second escalation loop. Public pressure rises, rumors spread. Leaders are forced to respond to visible dysfunction without being able to point to a visible attacker. Accusations harden before evidence does. Diplomatic space shrinks as domestic audiences demand certainty and action. And here's the paradox. The more governments try to reassure the public, the more they reveal how dependent they truly are on systems that have just proven fragile. In a US-China confrontation, this civilian impact matters strategically, because once everyday life is affected, restraint becomes politically expensive. Leaders are no longer managing a distant military crisis, they're managing societal disruption. That's when escalation accelerates, not because anyone wants war, but because the costs of not acting start to feel greater than the risks of acting. And by the time the public understands that space was the first battlefield, the conflict has already spilled into every other domain. The most dangerous wars are not the ones that announce themselves. They don't begin with speeches, sirens, or mushroom clouds. They begin with small failures that arrive without explanation. A satellite that stops responding, a signal that no longer lines up, a system that suddenly can't be trusted. In a future conflict between the United States and China, space may not be where the war is fought the hardest, but it may be where the war is decided first. Because once satellites are disrupted, everything else follows. Commanders lose clarity, forces lose coordination, civilian systems feel the shock, and decision makers are pushed into reacting under pressure with incomplete information and shrinking margins for error. That's the real danger of space warfare. Not that it's destructive, but that it's deceptively quiet. By the time leaders recognize that a hostile act has occurred, the strategic balance may already be shifting. The side that moves first doesn't need to win outright. It only needs to create confusion faster than the other side can restore order. And in a world where deterrence depends on clarity, confusion becomes a weapon. So the question isn't whether satellites will be targeted in the next major war. The question is whether anyone will be able to agree, in time, that a war has already begun. Because the first battlefield may be invisible, and by the time the rest of the world hears the noise, the outcome may already be locked in.